On November 17, 1986, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 was crossing Alaska at 35,000 feet when Captain Kenju Terauchi noticed something ahead of the aircraft. At first, it did not look especially dramatic, just lights. Two groups of them, slightly below and off the left side of the cockpit. Terauchi asked his crew to look. They saw them too. For several minutes, the lights remained there while the cargo jet continued toward Anchorage. Then they moved. The distance seemed to close. The crew could not identify an aircraft shape, could not match the lights to normal traffic, and could not explain why they appeared to be keeping pace with a 747. So Terauchi did what commercial pilots are supposed to do when unknown traffic gets too close. He called air traffic control. Anchorage Center checked the area. There was supposed to be nothing there. A few minutes later, Terauchi reported something on the aircraft's own radar. Then military controllers reported a brief primary radar return near the JAL Flight. And before the encounter was over, Anchorage Center would authorize a descent, a course change, and a full 360-degree turn, while another airliner was sent toward the area to look. The Federal Aviation Administration eventually collected transcripts, radar data, crew interviews, controller statements, and flight path records. Decades later, those records are still preserved in the U.S. National Archives. But the FAA's final position was much less dramatic than the story that would grow around the flight. It said the event could not be confirmed. That leaves us with a very specific question. What did three experienced crew members actually see over Alaska that night? And how much of the famous JAL 160-28 story is supported by the records? Flight 168 was not a sightseeing flight, and its crew was not looking for anything unusual. The Boeing 747 freighter was flying a long cargo route through Reykjavik and Anchorage on the way toward Japan. Captain Terauchi was in the left seat. First Officer Takanori Tamefuji was beside him, and a flight engineer sat behind the pilots. The aircraft was cruising normally through clear Alaskan air. Outside, the light was fading. The flight engineer later remembered a strip of sunset in one direction and darkness behind the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the lighting had already been reduced for night flying. It was the kind of environment where distant lights stand out sharply against the sky. That point would later matter to both believers and skeptics. But before anybody could argue about what the crew saw, the crew had to decide whether another aircraft was simply flying too close. At approximately 0219 UTC, Anchorage Center received the first important radio call. Terauchi asked whether the controller had traffic near his aircraft. The answer was no. Nothing known was supposed to be there. The captain responded that he had traffic moving in the same direction, roughly a mile ahead and close to his altitude. When the controller asked about identifiable markings, Terauchi could not give him a registration, a recognizable aircraft type, or a conventional lighting pattern. He described white and yellow lights. That is the first major piece of the case, and it is worth keeping it simple. At this point, nobody on the ground had confirmed a mysterious craft. Three people in a cockpit were looking at lights they could not identify. The flight engineer's later FAA interview gives us a useful check against the more dramatic versions of the story. He remembered clusters of white or amber-colored lights near the 11 o'clock position. He said they were immediately noticeable and that the first group remained visible for something like 10 minutes. But when investigators asked him for the shape of the object, his answer was much less certain. He did not know. He had seen lights. He compared their arrangement to the windows of an aircraft viewed from another aircraft, but he could not describe a solid body around them. That distinction matters. Captain Terauchi would eventually describe much more than lights. The other crew members were more cautious, and that is exactly the kind of difference we should expect from real witnesses. People standing only a few feet apart do not always perceive the same event in the same way. They notice different details. They remember different moments. Sometimes, one person becomes much more certain than the others. The flight engineer never changed his basic position. The lights he first saw were unusual and different from town lights, but he did not claim that he could identify what produced them. Then the case took its first strange turn. Terauchi said the unidentified traffic was appearing on the 747's weather radar. At about 0225 UTC, according to the FAA chronology, Flight 16T28 reported a radar target in the 11 o'clock position at approximately 8 miles. The crew later described a green return on the cockpit display. A weather radar is built primarily to detect precipitation, not to function like an air traffic control radar. So a return on that screen does not automatically mean another aircraft was there. But from inside the cockpit, the combination was uncomfortable. Unusual lights outside, and something appearing on the radar in approximately the same general direction. Anchorage Center contacted the Military Regional Operations Control Center and asked whether they had anything near the JAL Flight. About a minute later, the military side reported a primary radar return around the 10 o'clock position, also at roughly 8 miles. Then it disappeared. For a brief moment, the situation looked more serious. A pilot was reported unidentified traffic. His own radar appeared to show something. And another radar system had produced a return near the aircraft. But this is also where one of the most repeated claims about JAL 16228 needs to be handled carefully. The official FAA review later said its recorded radar data did not confirm another aircraft. The early radar returns were real entries in the chronology. Their interpretation was the problem. Terauchi continued watching the lights, while the 747 moved deeper into Alaska. At around 0231 UTC, he told Anchorage Center that whatever he was seeing was quite big. The controller gave the crew permission to deviate as necessary. 1 minute later, Flight 1628 requested a descent from 35,000 feet to 31,000 feet. Anchorage approved it. When the controller asked whether the unidentified traffic was descending with them, the captain said it was descending in formation. That was no longer the language of a pilot casually pointing out a strange light on the horizon. Terauchi believed something was staying with his aircraft. Anchorage then approved a heading change. Near Fairbanks, controllers checked with Fairbanks Approach to see whether its radar showed anything close to the 747. It did not. The evidence was already becoming messy. One crew had a visual sighting. The captain was convinced the object was following them. There had been intermittent radar indications. Yet another radar facility could see nothing unusual, and the crew had still not identified a normal aircraft. Then Anchorage Center tried something more direct. At approximately 0236 UTC, Flight 1628 was instructed to make a 360-degree turn. The idea was straightforward. If another aircraft or object was pacing the Boeing, a full circle could change the geometry enough to reveal what was happening. A fixed light in the distance should behave differently from traffic staying physically close. The crew entered the turn. Terauchi continued to report the object. A few minutes later, he said he had lost sight of it. Then it appeared again. The chronology records the traffic at the 9 o'clock position and later at 7 o'clock, roughly 8 miles away. Somewhere in this part of the encounter, Terauchi's description became far more extraordinary than the original lights. He said there was a much larger dark presence near the aircraft. In later interviews and statements, he compared its apparent scale to something enormous, far beyond a conventional airliner. This is the image that would make JAL 1628 famous. A 747 flying through the Alaskan night with a gigantic object nearby. But there is an important limitation. The captain was the witness who gave the dramatic description of the enormous form. The other crew members did not independently provide the same detailed description of a giant, solid craft. The flight engineer was especially cautious about the later light he saw to the side, telling the FAA that it had been difficult to see and that he was not completely certain whether it might have been distant lights. So the famous massive craft belongs first in the category of Captain Terauchi's claim, not as a fact established by all three witnesses. That does not make the story unimportant. It makes it more interesting, because the strongest part of JAL 1628 is not necessarily the size Terauchi assigned to the object. The stronger part is that the crew was reporting something unusual in real time, while air traffic controllers were trying to work out whether there was a genuine hazard near a commercial aircraft. This was not a story told from memory 20 years later. There was an active conversation happening while the event was underway. The controllers had to make decisions. They could not simply tell the crew that the lights were probably stars and move on. If an unknown aircraft was operating without a transponder near a 747, that was a safety problem regardless of what anyone thought about UFOs. So Anchorage Center continued checking radar, speaking with the military, and giving the JAL crew room to maneuver. At about 02:38, the Military Control Center called Anchorage again and reported what the FAA chronology described as a flight of 2 in the position of Flight 1628, with one return, apparently primary only. 4 minutes later, that contact was no longer being tracked. Those few radar reports would later become central to arguments that something physical had been there. But the FAA would eventually interpret the data very differently. Before we get to that explanation, there was one more attempt to find an independent witness. A United Airlines flight was approaching from the opposite direction. Anchorage Center asked the crew whether they would be willing to alter course slightly and look toward the Japan Airlines aircraft. They agreed. This was potentially the cleanest test of the night. A second professional flight crew, arriving from another angle, might see whatever had been shadowing JAL 162 At around 0250 UTC, the United crew reported that they could see the Japan Airlines 747 against a lighter background. They could not see any other traffic. A military aircraft was also in the broader area during the later stages, but no independent visual confirmation of Terauchi's object emerged. A few minutes later, Flight 1628 reported that it had lost contact with the unidentified traffic. The encounter was effectively over. The 747 continued to Anchorage and landed normally. Nobody had been injured. No collision had occurred. There was no physical object to recover, and no photograph that settled the question. But unlike most unusual pilot stories, this one now came with an official paper trail. FAA personnel interviewed the crew after landing. Their initial notes described the three men as normal, professional, and rational, with no indication of drug or alcohol involvement. That observation is sometimes repeated as though it proves their interpretation of the event. It does not. A completely competent pilot can misidentify something. So can an air traffic controller. Expertise reduces some kinds of error. It does not eliminate perception problems altogether, but the crew's professional condition does matter for a narrower reason. Investigators did not think they were dealing with intoxication, obvious impairment, or a group of people behaving irrationally. The witnesses seemed sincerely concerned about what they had seen. The captain provided drawings. The crew described the lights and the radar indication. Later, the FAA conducted separate, more detailed interviews. And those interviews reveal something that simplified retellings often miss. The witnesses agreed on the presence of unusual lights, but they did not agree with equal confidence on every dramatic feature of the encounter. The flight engineer explicitly said that he was not sure the object was a UFO. His mind, he told the investigator, had not changed since the first interview. He had seen something unusual. He simply did not know what it was. That difference between "I saw something unusual" and "I know what it was" is the line this entire case sits on. Terauchi became convinced that what he encountered was extraordinary. His crew remained more reserved. Air traffic control took the report seriously enough to protect the aircraft and search for traffic. Yet the system designed to track airplanes did not produce the kind of clean, continuous target that would have solved the problem immediately. The FAA gathered an unusually large amount of material: pilot controller transcripts, personnel statements, crew interviews, radar plots, flight path charts, and computer data. The records eventually became part of an FAA series now held by the National Archives under the JAL 16028 case. That alone tells us the event generated real institutional attention. It does not tell us the answer. The radar is where the story usually divides into two completely different versions. In one version, multiple radar systems confirmed a giant unidentified craft tracking the 747. In the other, radar proved that nothing unusual was there. Neither description captures the full record very well. During the encounter, controllers did receive intermittent returns that appeared close enough to the JAL flight to be worth checking. Military controllers also reported brief primary returns. That is documented. But when the FAA later reviewed the recorded Anchorage radar data using specialists and matching equipment at its technical center, it concluded that the apparent secondary target close to the JAL aircraft was not another airplane. The agency identified it as an uncorrelated primary and beacon return, a split image associated with the 747 itself. In simple terms, the radar could make one aircraft appear as though two targets were present because the reflected radar return and the aircraft's transponder signal did not line up exactly. The FAA described this as a known phenomenon. Its December chronology was even more direct. The recorded Anchorage radar data did not confirm the presence of the traffic reported by Flight 1628. That is a major limitation, and leaving it out would make the case sound stronger than the official record supports. If you hear that FAA radar confirmed the UFO, you are hearing only the first half of the story. Controllers initially believed they might be seeing another target. The later technical review did not support that conclusion. The military returns create another layer of uncertainty, because brief primary contacts were reported near the aircraft during the event, but they were not maintained as a clear track of an unknown craft. So radar gives us an anomaly, not a clean confirmation. It may tell us why controllers became concerned. It does not prove that an enormous object followed the Boeing through Alaska. This leaves the visual testimony doing most of the work. And visual testimony is where the crew disagreement becomes critical. Could the lights have been ordinary astronomical objects? Bright planets, stars, and horizon lights have fooled pilots before, particularly at night, when distance becomes almost impossible to judge. A light with no visible background reference can seem to move when the observer's own aircraft moves. It can appear closer than it is. Atmospheric conditions can distort color and intensity. That general explanation fits some parts of JAL 16T28 better than others. The flight engineer himself remained unsure whether one of the later lights might have been something distant. But the crew's initial clusters of lights appeared unusual enough that several people in the cockpit immediately noticed them, and Terauchi reported relative movement that he believed did not behave like a fixed astronomical source. Could the entire thing have been a misinterpretation of lights combined with radar artifacts? Yes, that is a serious possibility. Can the surviving records prove that explanation? No. The FAA's final public release did not identify the visual phenomenon. It simply said it had been unable to confirm the reported UFO event and that its radar review did not establish another aircraft nearby. And there is another point that often gets lost. The FAA was not conducting an extraterrestrial investigation. Its responsibility was air traffic safety. Officials wanted to know whether an unreported aircraft had been operating dangerously close to Japan Airlines 1628. Once the technical review showed no confirmed second aircraft on FAA radar, and once the flight had landed safely, the agency had much less reason to keep pursuing the question, what did those lights really look like? In its March 1987 release, the FAA said it was satisfied that the safety of the air traffic control system had not been compromised and planned no further investigation of the circumstances. That is not the same as announcing that every visual observation had been explained. It is also not the same as admitting that a UFO had been confirmed. The agency reached a much narrower conclusion. It could not confirm the event as reported. Now return to Captain Terauchi, because this is where the human side of the case becomes more complicated. He was not merely reporting a strange light by the time the story reached the public. He had come to believe that the aircraft had encountered something extraordinary. He described the later object as enormous. He drew what he thought he had seen. His interpretation was much stronger than that of his flight engineer. That created a problem for investigators and, later, for anyone trying to tell this story fairly. Should the captain's confidence be treated as evidence? Not by itself. Pilots are trained observers, but they are still human. Confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. At the same time, calling Terauchi mistaken does not tell us what produced the original observations. We still have a cockpit crew that noticed unusual lights, an onboard radar return they considered suspicious, real-time calls to air traffic control, evasive or investigative maneuvers approved by controllers, and brief radar contacts that generated genuine concern before the FAA later interpreted the recorded data as artifacts. That is why the case survives. Not because every dramatic claim was verified, but because the ordinary explanation is not written neatly into a single line of the file. There is also a detail from the flight engineer's interview that feels almost mundane, and for that reason, useful. At one point, the crew considered taking photographs. Terauchi had a camera bag behind his seat. The flight engineer handed it forward. They never produced a usable photograph. According to the interview, the captain was unable to operate the camera effectively under the circumstances. That is frustrating for anyone looking back at the case, because a clear photograph might have changed everything. But it is also exactly the kind of awkward detail that occurs in real life. A professional flight crew in a dark cockpit is not a documentary team. They are flying a 747. They are talking to controllers. They are watching instruments. And suddenly, someone is trying to find a camera and work out the settings before the lights disappear. No photograph was taken. We are left with testimony and records instead. By the end of the FAA inquiry, the case had acquired two very different reputations. Among UFO researchers, JAL 16028 became one of aviation's most famous close encounters because it involved professional witnesses, recorded air traffic communications, and reported radar anomalies. Within the FAA's public conclusion, however, the picture was far more restrained. The agency released its documents in March 1987 and said it was unable to confirm the reported sighting. Its radar specialists had explained the apparent second Anchorage radar target as a split return from the JAL 747. The United Airlines crew sent toward the area had seen the Japan Airlines aircraft, but nothing accompanying it. And the FAA had no evidence that an unreported aircraft had created a continuing threat to the air traffic system. Those facts do not destroy the visual report. They simply put a ceiling on what the evidence can support. So what can we actually say happened over Alaska on November 17, 1986? We can say that the three-person crew of Japan Airlines Flight 1628 reported unusual lights during a cargo flight toward Anchorage. We can say they contacted air traffic control while the event was still happening. We can say Captain Terauchi became convinced that a very large unidentified object was accompanying his aircraft. We can say the flight crew reported a radar indication on their weather radar. We can say Anchorage Center and military controllers received intermittent returns that caused enough concern for controllers to check other radar facilities and permit changes in altitude and heading. We can say the Boeing performed a 360-degree turn. We can say a United Airlines crew was brought toward the area and did not see the reported object. And we can say the FAA's later technical review concluded that its radar records did not confirm a second aircraft near JAL 16028. Those pieces are documented. What we cannot say is that multiple radar systems conclusively tracked an enormous spacecraft for 50 minutes. The official records do not support that claim. We cannot say all three crew members independently described the same giant craft. They did not. We cannot say the FAA concluded that something extraterrestrial had followed the aircraft. It did not. And we cannot say nothing happened simply because the FAA could not confirm a second radar target. Three crew members did report unusual visual observations, and their real-time concern is preserved in the investigation. The mystery exists in the distance between those two statements. Something was perceived. The interpretation remains uncertain. If you enjoy cases examined this way, where the original records matter more than the legend that grew around them, you can subscribe for the next investigation. Because JAL 16028 is a useful reminder of how strange stories change over time. The captain's enormous object became the headline. The radar became confirmation. The encounter became a chase. But when we return to the actual FAA material, the case is quieter and more difficult. A veteran captain saw something that deeply convinced him. Two other crew members saw unusual lights, but were more cautious about what those lights represented. Controllers treated the report as a potential safety issue. Radar produced confusing information in real time. And after months of review, the agency responsible for that airspace could neither confirm the mysterious aircraft nor tell us exactly what the crew had been looking at. The most interesting moment may not be Terauchi's description of something enormous in the darkness. It may be the moment Anchorage Center told a 747 crew there was no known traffic near them, and the crew looked outside and continued to see lights anyway. Because from that point forward, every explanation has to account for two things at once: what the instruments eventually failed to confirm, and what three people in that cockpit believed they were watching over Alaska.